Give me your thoughts on, guys like Saddam, Gaddafi. I mean, one of the clips that, man, it's just gone crazy is that clip of General Wesley Clark when he was at, I think, the Pentagon in 2007, and he's like talking about the 7 countries in 5 years and all that. I mean, it really feels like when I looked at Saddam, when I looked at Gaddafi, prior to digging into this stuff, I always thought, oh, these guys are just awful human beings. And then you look into them and you realize they really, I mean, I'm sure they had bad parts to them. Same thing with like Bashar al Assad in Syria. But like, man, they really were painted to be something different than I feel like they truly are. Was it all about oil? Was it all about needing an enemy for the military industrial complex? What are your thoughts on Saddam, on Gaddafi, on Assad, the situation in Syria? Because I know you know a lot about them.
Well, look, I think Gaddafi was probably the least worst of the three.
Okay.
Although even, Assad was an ophthalmologist in London when his older brother died in a car wreck. His older brother was supposed to be the dictator, not him. And so it doesn't mean he was a great leader, but it's not like he was just raised that way. Saddam Hussein really was a ruthless, horrible guy, who raised his sons to be torturers and future dictators and taken power in a bloody coup d'etat at the time, back in 79, and fought the war against Iran ruthlessly with American supplied and American purchased and German supplied chemical weapons and even biological weapons. And well, I don't know if he actually used them, but he certainly developed them. So he was horrible. At the same time, though, like implied in your question, was he a threat to his neighbors? Was he an aggressive, threat? And the thing is, they would cite his invasion of Iran and Kuwait, but America gave him the green light to invade Iran, and they gave him like a flashing yellow light to invade Kuwait. He came to America and asked permission in both cases. So, and in the case of Kuwait, it was really a divided response. I don't think they trapped him into it deliberately, but in effect, they did. They told the Kuwaitis to be intransigent. And then they told Saddam, you don't have to take that from them. And then they told him, wait, don't. But then it was kind of too late. So they had given him, basically a flashing yellow light. Hey, we're not interested in your border dispute with Kuwait. And even after he originally invaded, they were going to let him get away with it, just draw the line at Saudi Arabia. So they
Got it.
built up this threat in order to launch the war. They said he's Hitler. He's going to consolidate control over the oil supplies of the Middle East. Next thing you know, he'll be marching on Paris, right? So which was just completely crazy. But then once you call the guy Hitler, well, now you can't compromise with him because he's Hitler. And so would you compromise with Hitler? Remember what Neville Chamberlain and his failure at Munich, blah, blah, blah. So now they just had to they talked themselves and the Israelis talked them into keeping this Cold War policy against Iraq all for the rest of the 20th century, all through the 90s and the rest of the century leading up into the W. Bush years, which is totally unnecessary. They could have normalized relations with Iraq back then. It's
Yeah.
the same
Yeah.
situation with Iran and the Ayatollah. Would you want to be sexy liberal young woman from Tehran in Iran right now? No, but you're not one. And so do you care? No, right? Like, is the Ayatollah really a threat to the United States in any way? Of course not.
No,
They're
totally.
rivals for power in the region, but why is America power in the region in the first place? We don't need to be there at all. As even bin Laden himself had joked that, what am I going to do with this oil? Drink it? It has
Yeah.
to be for
Yeah.
sale anyway, right? Even if the head terrorist was in charge of it all, it's still got to be for sale. We really don't have to be there. And
Yeah.
I have to tell you, it's not really fair to say, well, what's it all about? Is it all about the oil or all about the weapons? Because what it is it's a vast conspiracy of interest, right? You have a bunch of government job holders. You have the military industrial complex. You do have oil interests, although mostly the American oil companies don't care who's in charge, man. They want stability and to just pump the
Right.
oil.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and then you have the Israelis and, the Israelis have their own agenda and
Yeah.
it includes, compiling and exercising a vast amount of influence in the United States. You asked about the neoconservative movement and have they always been so much about Israel? And the answer is yeah. There just happens to be a huge overlap with Zionism and, this movement of former Trotskyites. Part of why they moved right, as I said, was in reaction to the new left's reaction against Israel in the 67 war. And they said, well, screw that. We're throwing in with the Republicans full scale here. And, previous generation of them had been writing for the National Review and had already moved to the right, years before. But there's like, first, second, and third generation neocons all kind of making this pilgrimage from the Trotskyite left to the militarist right during that time. And this is a big part of it. And so now Andrew Coburn is this great journalist, his brother Patrick Coburn as well. And Andrew talks about how in 1970s, what happened essentially was, this is kind of unheard of these days, but it did exist still then. There were like no Jews allowed at certain country clubs and in certain business, areas and whatever. And it was maybe sort of the last gasp of that during that era. But like the Council on Foreign Relations, there were some Jews there and some Catholics. But for the most part, the Council on Foreign Relations was a very Brooks Brothers WASPy kind of a thing with, a bunch of Episcopalians and very high WASPy social class folk like that ran it. It had been created by the Morgans and then had fallen under the control of the Rockefellers, and who were, for their era, they were kind of new money, but they were, basically the population of the place were very much Harvard and Yale and Princeton folk, and so there was, this whole era. The neoconservatives were only one example of this, but this was happening all over the place, where you had middle class people who could afford to go to college and were intellectuals and wanted to participate in politics, who didn't fit into those social classes and really weren't welcome. And in the neoconservative movement, many of them were Jews and some of them were Catholics. There were a couple Presbyterians involved, but mostly, who was ever a group of Trotskyites, right? They came from Brooklyn. Like that was the kind of people who ever were, Trotskyoids in the first place to ever have to move to the right from there.
Yeah.
So, but they could only make so much progress inside the Council on Foreign Relations, which, as I said, represented really Rockefeller power at that time, and which was, in other words, oil and banking, right? Standard Oil and Citigroup and Chase, right? What became Citigroup was then National City Bank and Chase Manhattan Bank. And so those are two of the biggest banks in the country, both Rockefeller banks, and then all their huge oil interests over there. So then these neoconservatives, they wanted to have their say. They didn't have any money, right? They
Yeah.
were just middle-class guys. So they made their mob alliance with the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex needs money from the Treasury. They also
Yeah.
needed eggheads to write the studies to justify what it is that they're doing and why. And so that's oversimplifying it. But essentially, if oil and banking had the CFR, the MIC needed the neocons.
The
And so
NATO.
that's where then the neoconservatives, with especially Lockheed dollars, they founded the Weekly Standard. They infiltrated, pre-standing foundations like the Olin and Scaife and Mellon foundations, and then took over at Heritage, Hoover, and the American Enterprise Institute, AEI. And then they also set up all of their own think tanks, such as the Project for New American Century, the Committee on the Present Danger, the Center for Security Policy, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and 100 more later, the Foreign Policy Initiative, and all of these. And so, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs is another important one. When I went through that list of all those neoconservatives in the W. Bush administration, these are the guys that Colin Powell said. They set up a separate government inside the government under the control of the vice president, Dick Cheney. And this neocon network, he called them the Jinsa crowd. And he said they were this separate government. And when he says it, he's talking about David Wormser and Michael Maloof and their buddies, right? The neoconservatives, and how, and so Powell, for people who are too young to remember, this is why anybody voted for W. Bush, was they said, well, Colin Powell's going to be up there driving the car and it's going to be okay. But
Yeah.
no, Colin Powell was marginalized from the very beginning. Dick Cheney is actually the
That guy was driving
dog.
the car, right? Cheney was driving the car.
That's right.
Everybody we've talked about has kind of been conservative Republican. So where do
Mhm.
the Clintons fit into this? Where
Uh,
do even the Obamas, the Bidens, like the powerful Democrats, where do they fit in? Is it really a uniparty? Are they part of this entity? They just don't, they don't claim it?
Well, so the thing is, when I talk about how these guys were Trotskyites, a lot of them, on their way to the Republican Party were Cold War Democrats. And in fact, there was a Democrat senator from Washington State named Scoop Jackson. They called him the senator from Boeing. And a bunch of these guys, Wolfowitz and Pearl and Khalilzad and Libby, had all worked for him for a while in the 70s. So that was like sort of the halfway house as they were moving to the right. But so in a way, why were they such bad Republicans? Because they were Cold War Democrats. They were Harry Truman, nuke 'em all guys, was a big part of it. And see, because they were Trotskyites, they hated the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was Stalinist, right? And they were Americans. So might as well side with America in the Cold War. And then on the right, you have people there were too many people on the right who were skeptical of militarism. but the neocons weren't. So the Cold Warriors brought in the neocons to be the vanguard of the conservative right, supposedly, in waging the Cold War. That was how they got all those great jobs at the National Review, as long as they would be hawks. And any conservative wouldn't toe the line on the Cold War was kicked to the curb.
Okay.
Now,
Okay.
so the Democrats themselves, they always sucked, right? And
Yeah.
they have a thing. Now, I don't want anybody to get me wrong here. I'm a libertarian. I'm a pure like gold, guns, and property rights, free market guy. It's if
Yeah.
humanity's gonna survive, it's free markets is the only way to go. Okay, is forget about that. Anybody who says anything otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's purely my take. Just so you understand, when I say that, leftists have really idiotic agriculture policies and lots of other things that they think, but they can be hardcore anti-war. And a lot of times that'll be because they see through the militarist project because of what leftists they are, and maybe to a fault, but with a great degree of accuracy. They see the machinations of the military industrial complex. They see just what we've been talking about this whole time, this rent-seeking cronyism. Keep America at war so we can keep selling weapons, right? Where the cart is before the horse. And this is not how we're supposed to do it. And the old saying from Malcolm X that if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. Well, I like to say if you stand for anything, you'll notice that some things aren't right. You know what I mean? Even if you're all wrong, if you have some kind of consistent point of view, then you're going to notice all of the crazy stuff going on around you that really doesn't fit in with the system the way that they had described it to you before. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So you have a lot of criticism of the warfare state from the left. But then what does that mean for a liberal Democrat? That means you don't want to be caught dead sounding like them because they're anti-American communist leftists. And
Right.
so how do you prove that you're not? You prove that you're not by being an avowedly corrupt, corporatist, cronyist, militarist, imperialist. You
Yeah.
prove you're not a commie by being Bill Clinton, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when W. Bush wants to go to war, you see all the center-left liberal Democrats all climb on board to prove what lefties they're not. Right? They call this hippie punching, right? They go, oh, those hippies are against the war, but not me. I'm a good, loyal American flag waving militarist. Hoorah, let's go to war. Which is funny because this is one of the only reasons if you ask a regular guy or gal out there in the world, maybe this is too outdated from a previous era, but this is true up until recent past anyway. If you ask somebody why to prefer a Democrat at all, it would be because maybe they're less militarist. People would think of people like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and John McCain and Mitt Romney and say, well, we want the opposite of that. We want somebody who's more intellectual, more understanding, and
Yeah.
not so quick to go to war. But then listen to just think in your own medium term memory here about how this works, how these incentives play out in Democratic politics. What do you get? You get nothing but hawks. You get
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris and John Kerry and Barack Obama saying, don't you call me a wimp. Look at my muscular foreign policy. Oh, I'm tough. Don't you say that you'd vote for me because I would be more intellectual and softer and more understanding and seek alternatives to fighting, because
Yeah.
that sounds like just being a wimp. And that
Yeah.
sounds maybe like being a leftist, anti-American communist. And so forget that. And so they called this in the Clinton campaign in 92. It was his sister soldier moment, was what they call this, because there was this woman who became, for a very short time, she was part of Public Enemy. And she had made a statement that, like, what's up with black people killing each other all the time? Why don't you kill some white people for a change, or something
Yeah.
stupid like that? It was a stupid thing to say, but it was like, whatever. She was like a 21-year-old girl. Like, who cares what she says about anything anyway? Right. And Bill Clinton comes out and goes, yeah, well, I disagree with that sister soldier. Why? She's just terrible. Vote Bill. I'm just one hair left of center. You can trust me, right? And then, so like, that's their whole shtick. That's their whole thing. Why is Hillary Clinton? And see, Hillary Clinton lost to Barack Obama
Yeah.
because she was such a militarist, right? And then so did John McCain,
Yeah.
right? And then Barack Obama hires her to be a Secretary of State. And the first thing she does is monger the surge in Afghanistan. You
Yep.
have to triple the war. You have to listen to the generals. You have to listen to the Secretary of Defense. If they want to escalate the war, you have to escalate the war. Her job was to give him some running room. She's Secretary of State. She's supposed to say, well, geez, I don't know, Mr. President. What if you negotiated and made it? No, She's saying you got to double down, triple the war. Then the next thing she does is essentially strong arm Obama and force him into launching the war in Libya. And
Libya.
why? We know why she did it. She did it for herself. She did it so that she could run on the war in Libya in 2016 and that she
Wow.
could say, unlike stupid W. Bush, I know how to do it right. I launched this war and everything turned out great. Now, of course, everything didn't turn out great. It turned into a horrible civil war. You had ISIS and Al Qaeda suicide bombers and head choppers running around everywhere, and they re-legalized chattel slavery of Black Africans, of sub-Saharan Africans there.
Insane.
So by
That's insane.
so by 2016, she shut the hell up about it and didn't want to say it. But we know why she launched the war. She launched the war so that she could run as a man, essentially, right? Like that in her conception. She doesn't want to be accused of being feminine, which
Right.
equates to weak. And because Americans won't tolerate a weak leader. So she's going to be a woman. She's got to be the toughest woman on the block. Look at my muscular foreign policy, she would say. And even when she campaigned in 16, she ran around with Robert Kagan, just the way that Kamala Harris was running around with
This change.
Elizabeth Cheney.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And saying, look at me, I'm muscular, I'm tough, I'm a militarist. When what that does, of course, is it doesn't inspire right wing tough guys to cross the line and vote for Democratic women just because they're bloodthirsty. Like that's not for
Right.
Hillary Clinton. Republicans are going to vote for Hillary Clinton just because she promises to let blood. No. And then, but meanwhile, it convinces leftists to stay home. People who are progressives and socialists and others who might vote Democrat, they see these people running around with the Cheneys and the Kagans and they say, forget it. And they don't show up and they lose. But
Yep.
no matter how much, they lose 3-4 times in a row on this, right? And then they still do it. Watch, the next Democratic candidate is going to, whether man or woman, is going to be running on tough guy militarism, not
I'm,
like those sellout
yeah.
isolationists on the.
Want the full truth? Watch the full Deep Shallow Dive interview next. And hit subscribe if you're done with narratives and ready to call a spade a spade.